Okay. And yes, I think we are good. So, hello, my wild darlings. Good to see you. I am Tad. It is now 1 a.m. California time, and I hope wherever you might be and whatever time it might be for you, that you are doing well. I am doing well under the circumstances. I little cat hair issue going on, but other than that, I'm fine. Here, I'll crank that up, maybe get a little more air moving around here. Um, but other than that, fine. As I have mentioned a couple of times in a couple of places, including in the title of this particular reading, stroke broadcast, stroke whatever you want to call it, my live something or other. I am starting a new book tonight, and that is Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles, which was a huge, and I guess still is, a huge influence on me. I will talk more about that when I'm ready to start reading in a few minutes. Meanwhile, I've been off for a couple of weeks while I was figuring out what I was going to do next and various other things. But I'm here now. What else is there to tell? Well, just the usual stuff. As you can see, there are cats in the background. Whoops, that way. Cats in the background. And cats are fine. Dogs are fine. My beautiful and talented wife, Deborah, is fine. Dogs are dogs are dogs, as always. Poor Walter is old and feeble and silly, but then again, so am I, so that's okay. I finally got some coats for him to help him through the winter. Which took it took a certain amount of trying because I'd keep bringing coats home, and for whatever reason, first of all, he's tiny. He's tiny. He's built like a deer. They literally are two kinds of chihuahuas, for those of you who care. I never cared about chihuahuas until my wife inflicted them on me. I love dogs, so you get used to it, and you even start to find them charming, no matter what. And in fact, I have become sort of a grudging Chihuahua fan. There's two kinds of Chihuahuas. There is the apple-headed Chihuahua, which our first Chihuahua, Frankie, was, and that's obviously more round, slightly more pug-faced. Not pug-faced. They don't have that French bulldog look there, obviously, but the excuse me, slightly more blunt faces, and what are called the deer heads, which is what Walter is, meaning he is gracile. That is the opposite of robust. He is skinny. He has really long legs. He looks like a little tiny Doberman Pinscher. In fact, he may be a mini Pinscher. We've never had him tested for his genetics, but he came to us as a Chihuahua, and we are willing to give him the benefit of the doubt on that. Anyway, Walter is so small, about 4 pounds, and most of that is legs. He's got very long legs, a little skinny bod. Not as skinny as when we first got him, where he was emaciated and just heartbreaking to see. But even fattened up and healthy, he remained very thin. Looks more like a racing dog, like a greyhound or something, than a proper Chihuahua. But anyway, so it's always hard to try him in coats. We've tried many over the years because, especially as he's gotten older, he gets cold. So the first coat I bought for him this winter was, it's actually a very nicely made coat, but it's very thick, kind of stiff, and it stuck out in the back, so he looked like a beetle, and he hated it. If he fell over like a beetle or a turtle, he couldn't get back up again. And he was so small compared to the smallest coat. This was an extra small. He was so small that, when you bent the Velcro flap under it, like stuck out about 3 or 4 inches past the end of, where it was supposed to connect, because he's just so tiny. You can literally almost put your one hand around his chest. But I finally found something that's more like a sweater and got a couple of them, 3 of them now, because I lost one for a while. So Walter is now coated. He is now coated. And he's gotten used to it, and he doesn't fight too much when I put him on. Unlike, say, when I put it on him. Unlike, say, when we have to clip his nails, at which point you would think we were removing his toes with dental pliers or something. But anyway, so what else is there to tell? I'm working on the Splintered Sun. I am currently going through one of those irritating patches that some people consider to be writer's block, but I do not, because I know exactly what's going on. It has nothing to do with my self-confidence. It has everything to do with the fact that I have written myself down a blind alley. I will explain that in slightly more detail. But I can't obviously tell you too much about it because you don't know the story and you don't know, what it's going to be. And I also don't want to spoil it for when it's eventually done. But basically, I just wrote myself into a situation where I said, I don't like the way this is going right now. I feel like I've lost the momentum that was in the story because of the certain structural issues. And one of them had to do with who my focal point characters are. Another one had to do with the fact that I think I mentioned this a few weeks back, that I had a certain, what I call oscillation, which is one of the great crimes of new writers or old writers when they are not hitting on their all cylinders. An oscillation is when things are happening, but nothing is really advancing the plot. So I call that oscillation because it's a lot of movement without anything actually going forward. So I realized I was in an oscillatory phase of the story. And so I spent the last few days saying, I cannot go forward until I figure out how to fix this and how to make it work better. Because I feel now like I've suddenly... any of you have ever... I know if you've driven over the Grapevine and Highway 5 in California, you would know what I was talking about. But since most of you probably have not, they have on these... many places in America, certainly in California, they have what are called runaway truck ramps. So here's another weird analogy I'm going to make for you. And what a runaway truck ramp is just exactly what it sounds like, which is in a long downhill stretch of freeway, because trucks, these big 18-wheelers or whatever, are so huge that if the brakes fail, they're on a downhill slope, sometimes for several miles. And if the brakes fail, there's no way to stop this gigantic death machine, this like multi-ton, many ton vehicle going downhill. So in certain places like the Grapevine in California, which is between the Valley and Los Angeles, it's a windy highway stretch that goes up into the mountains and comes down the other side in LA if you're going from the Valley and vice versa. But they have what's called, and this is going back into the Valley at least, they have what's called a runaway truck ramp. And that is a long lane by the side of the freeway which ends in a giant pile of sand. And the idea is that if you're driving a truck and you lose your brakes, you steer over to this lane and eventually you hit the sand and it starts to slow you down and eventually hit the big pile of sand at the end and the truck just stops going because it can't drive through a gigantic pile of sand. Anyway, that's a long explanation, but I figured you non-Americans may not have things like that, or you might. Please feel free to tell me. But that's kind of what it felt like. It felt like the momentum of the story that I was very happy with up till about a week ago. Suddenly, as I added on in the next couple of chapters, I felt like the characters are not moving forward. In fact, they are, as I said, oscillating. And to me, this felt as though my momentum, my downhill momentum, because when I write a story, I always try to keep what I call downhill momentum, or as I refer to the experience of the reader, falling down the stairs, right? That every time a chapter ends, you're falling forward and suddenly the chapter ends and you're like, wait, what happened? I hope. And then I start you on another storyline that you had been saying the same thing about just a few chapters back. And so the irritation at not finding out what happened to the character you were just following is, I hope, mitigated by the fact that you are now being taken back to an outcome that you didn't get to find out before. And with this process, I hope to give the story, especially really long books, a kind of a downhill momentum, so that the reader is always being taken forward, or is leaning forward, or is, as I less kindly put it, falling downstairs constantly. And every time you think you've hit the bottom of the stairs, more stairs. But you also don't realize that you're being moved along. So I felt that I had hit the truck ramp, or at least a lot of sand on the freeway, and I was losing momentum. So I've kind of stopped for a few days and spent a great deal of time in the usual TAD thinking position, which is unabashedly horizontal. These days it also means that I have usually a small dog whose coat covers all of him but his butt, and his butt is where he gets coldest. I'm almost always, if I'm trying to think these days, I have a small dog who's parked his butt in my armpit or on my crotch, so he can stay warm, and try and figure these things out. And as I've also mentioned, as I will go into some detail actually in the next, or one of the next two mailing list letters, because I just wrote two different mailing list things, one of which I'll tell you about tonight, or just give you a general précis of what that's about. But anyway, so I had just written a long thing in the mailing list about, to the mailing list about me and dogs and me and distraction. But anyway, so that's what I have to do at times like this, is just literally go into my room, into our room, and, if not close the door, then put in earbuds and just lie there and think, because I need to try all these different ways. Because sometimes sometimes the answer is very simple and straightforward. Other times it is not simple and straightforward at all. And you have to kind of try all these small, simple fixes until you suddenly realize none of these addresses the main problem. Therefore, I will have to start thinking about how could I majorly change something that will fix this problem. And that's where I'm at the moment. So I think I'm beginning to get some inklings of how to fix it. And I still think it's going to be a great book. I've had this problem at some point with almost every book I've ever written. It's just part of the process. It's why, as I said, it's not writer's block. It's not being ready yet to get to the next part of the story. Anyway, before I start reading, two other things I was going to mention. All right, tomorrow, which is today, actually, later today, Sunday, I am going to be doing an AMA on Reddit. So anybody who wants to ask me a question, I will be trying to answer all questions on Reddit. And if you can get on Reddit, I'm sure you will find it advertised there. If not, it's just under my name. The other thing that I was going to mention was what? It had to do with, yes. I want to emphasize, for those of you who regularly watch this not live, but if you're seeing this on YouTube, please subscribe. I'm really trying to drive up the subscriptions for Chris Fab, who does really kind work for absolutely nothing. As with almost everybody in my orbit, they are working out of pure kindness, and Chris is one of them, and he's been putting these up for 4 going on 5 years now on YouTube. There's like 400 readings, and so if you're watching one of these on YouTube and you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe, because at least that's one way to thank Chris for his work. So anyway, all right, so now I'm going to quickly check in and see. Suzanne Owen says it's writer's not block. Exactly. That's very well put, Suzanne. And in fact, sometimes the only response to those kinds of knots is the Gordian knot response, which, for those of you, there was a famous, if you've heard of the Gordian knot, it was a famous puzzle from the ancient days that until this, I believe it was like a rope that had been put through a chariot harness somehow, and there was, some kind of legend attached to it that only such and such people could solve it and could get it untied. And apparently Alexander the Great came along, and after looking at it for a while, realizing that he wasn't going to be able to untie it either, he just took his sword out and chopped it and cut the rope and solved it that way. But that's where the Gordian knot expression comes from. And yes, sometimes these writer's block problems are, in fact, as Suzanne said, they are writer's knots. And sometimes you have to take the Gordian knot approach that Alexander took and just say, maybe I'm being too fine here. Maybe I've got to just chop this sucker out somehow. Anyway, so back to what we have. Cats are making a hellacious amount of noise back there. You guys having fun? I guess so. All right, so let's see who has showed up here. And I see Carly Schultz. And that may be a new name. Isaac, of course. Petra, hello. Suzanne, who I already said hello to, or who I at least already cited. Wouter, pleasure as always, sir. Melissa, Iris. Peter, Lach, my old friend from the Netherlands. Good to see you, Peter. Dirk, Rosalba, Anamika, Nikki, Ilva, my darling. Good to see you, too. Hope you're healing up. Or at least not having too many problems and pains. Christina, hello. There's Chris, as always. Good to see you, sir. Andre Stark, that's not a new name, but a less familiar one. So good to see you, Andre. Christy Sanders, Raziel or Raziel or Raziel Phoenix. And you'll have to tell me how you want that pronounced. And Nicole. And it says, and 4 more, but I don't know who made those, who those 4 are yet. So, Melissa Fuller, yes, hello. Melissa, Edo Opdendries has also checked in. So, hello, Edo. Melissa says, BC, which I am assuming is British Columbia, is loaded with truck run-out lanes. And Carly says, Kitty. See, I could be here for hours, and every time a cat shows up, that's all anybody cares about. Okay, so let us get to the Martian Chronicles, which I have, as usual, wasted a lot of time. Now, the Martian Chronicles is one of the first of the truly influential books that I read on my own, I think, when I was probably 10, something like that. Needless to say, if you have not read any of these stories before, it's not meant for 10-year-olds necessarily. They're fabulous, wonderful stories. I won't tell you the whole story. Basically, they were stories that were written by Bradbury back in the 50s primarily, and then one of his publishers suggested to him that with a little emendation here and there, he could turn it into kind of a novel, a sort of a novel in the sense of it all being thematically linked. So you will see those thematic links between the stories as we go along. We're not going to, by any means, read this tonight. There's a ton of stories. It's going to be several weeks worth, I'm sure. But they're all really good stories, and they get better and better and better until the last 2 stories, if I remember correctly, I think are among the best things Bradbury ever wrote. And that's saying a lot. Because Ray Bradbury, for those of you who, for some reason, maybe because you're younger and are not as familiar with his work or whatever, Ray Bradbury was one of the best pure writers of short fiction that we ever had. And not just in science fiction and fantasy. He's a great American, great short story writer, great writer. But there's a number of things about the book that seized on me, and I'll talk about them from time to time as we go. But one of the things that I loved, and I'm going to read a very short section from Bradbury's introduction. What I love about it is that it's a science fiction book that isn't really all that interested in science. Not that I'm not interested in science or that I think science fiction shouldn't be, at least in part, based in science. But Bradbury was not trying to write a book about how humans would travel to Mars. He was not trying to write anything like the Kim Stanley Robinson Green Mars books or anything. Kim Stanley Robinson Green Mars, Red Mars, anything like that. He was not trying to write a true prediction of how we were going to colonize Mars. He was writing a book about the world he knew, the America he knew, and using Mars as, in the same way that Tolkien created Middle-earth, he was using Mars as his way of examining the human condition. And as I've also said in the past, a lot of my favorite writers of that era, which were the ones who were very influential for me, were nominally science fiction writers. But Zelazny, Theodore Sturgeon, Michael Moorcock, Harlan Ellison, Ursula Le Guin, just to name some of my favorites, Philip K. Dick to an extent, although he was kind of more in the science fiction area, but he was definitely also somebody who was not hung up on trying to make everything scientifically accurate so much as he was trying to talk about being a human being. And Bradbury, that's definitely true. And his stories ranged all over the map in terms of what kind of genre they could fit into. Mainly because genre was much less of an issue then. There was not anywhere near as much narrow casting in science fiction and fantasy. And most of these stories were written at the same time that he was writing some of his great fantasy stories, like the October Country stories and things like that. But anyway, reading from Bradbury's introduction, he says, "All right then, what is Martian Chronicles? It is King Tut out of the tomb when I was 3, the Norse Eddas when I was 6, and Roman and Greek gods that romanced me when I was 10. Pure myth. If it had been practical, technologically efficient science fiction, it would have long since fallen to rust by the road. But since it is a self-separating fable, even the most deeply rooted physicists at Caltech accept breathing the fraudulent oxygen atmosphere I have loosed on Mars. Science and machines can kill each other off or be replaced. Myth, seen in mirrors, incapable of being touched, stays on. If it is not immortal, it almost seems such." And that, I think, is a very good summation. Certainly when I have approached science fiction myself, because I am not a scientist, albeit I am a fan of science, I very much take that same approach. If the deeper stuff resonates, the technical stuff is just there. It's just there. It's the scenery. It's the backdrops. It's the costuming. But it is not the script. It is not the story. It is not what people will care about and remember. And certainly I tried in my science fiction to be at least scientifically reasonable, but I never wanted that to become more important than the story itself. And that is why I will never be a hard science fiction writer, and that is why Bradbury was never a hard science fiction writer. Anyway, let us continue, and let us begin the Martian Chronicles. So, as I said, there are these little small bits at the beginnings of the stories and between the stories that are the bits that Bradbury added in the late 1950s, early 1960s to turn his collection of seemingly unrelated Mars stories into a single book. So I am going to begin, and from the rest of the evening tonight, or the rest of the morning, depending on where you are, of this reading, I'm going to be reading from The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. January 2030. Rocket summer. 1 minute it was Ohio winter, with doors closed, windows locked, the panes blind with frost, icicles fringing every roof, children skiing on slopes, housewives lumbering like great black bears in their furs along the icy streets. And then a long wave of warmth crossed the small town, a flooding sea of hot air. It seemed as if someone had left a bakery door open. The heat pulsed among the cottages and bushes and children. The icicles dropped, shattering to melt. The doors flew open. The windows flew up. The children worked off their wool clothes. The housewives shed their bare disguises. The snow dissolved and showed last summer's ancient green lawns. Rocket summer. The words passed among the people in the open airing houses. Rocket summer. The warm desert air changing the frost patterns on the windows, erasing the artwork. The skis and sleds suddenly useless. The snow falling from the cold sky upon the town turned to a hot rain before it touched the ground. Rocket summer. People leaned from their dripping porches and watched the reddening sky. The rocket lay on the launching field, blowing out pink clouds of fire and oven heat. The rocket stood in the cold winter morning, making summer with every breath of its mighty exhausts. The rocket made climates, and summer lay for a brief moment upon the land. February 2030. Yilla. Now, quick explanation before I start the story. The characters have Martian names, and Yilla, Y-L-L-A, is the character the story is named after. But various other characters have names like Mr. T or Mr. YYY. So I'm just going to say them that way. I'm sure that Bradbury was basically just intending to show how unearth-like their names were. So I'm just going to spell them out. They had a house of crystal pillars on the planet Mars by the edge of an empty sea. And every morning you could see Mrs. K eating the golden fruits that grew from the crystal walls, or cleaning the house with handfuls of magnetic dust, which, taking all dirt with it, blew away on the hot wind. Afternoons, when the fossil sea was warm and motionless, and the wine trees stood stiff in the yard, and the little distant Martian bone town was all enclosed, and no one drifted out their doors, you could see Mr. K himself in his room, reading from a metal book with raised hieroglyphs over which he brushed his hand, as one might play a harp. And from the book, as his fingers stroked, a voice sang, a soft, ancient voice, which told tales of when the sea was red steam on the shore, and ancient men had carried clouds of metal insects and electric spiders into battle. Mr. and Mrs. K had lived by the Dead Sea for 20 years, and their ancestors had lived in the same house, which turned and followed the sun, flower-like, for 10 centuries. Mr. and Mrs. K were not old. They had the fair brownish skin of the true Martian, the yellow coin eyes, the soft musical voices. Once they had liked painting pictures with chemical fire, swimming in the canals in the seasons when the wine trees filled them with green liquors, and talking into the dawn together by the blue phosphorus portraits in the speaking room. They were not happy now. This morning, Mrs. K stood between the pillars, listening to the desert sand's heat melt into yellow wax and seemingly run on the horizon. Something was going to happen. She waited. She watched the blue sky of Mars as if it might at any moment grip in on itself, contract, and expel a shining miracle down upon the sand. Nothing happened. Tired of waiting, she walked through the misting pillars. A gentle rain sprang from the fluted pillar tops, cooling the scorched air, falling gently on her. On hot days, it was like walking in a creek. The floors of the house glittered with cool streams. In the distance, she heard her husband playing his book steadily, his fingers never tired of the old songs. Quietly, she wished he might one day again spend as much time holding and touching her like a little harp as he did his incredible books. But no. She shook her head, an imperceptible, forgiving shrug. Her eyelids closed softly down upon her golden eyes. Marriage made people old and familiar while still young. She lay back in a chair that moved to take her shape even as she moved. She closed her eyes tightly and nervously. The dream occurred. Her brown fingers trembled, came up, grasped at the air. A moment later, she sat up, startled, gasping. She glanced about swiftly as if expecting someone there before her. She seemed disappointed. The space between the pillars was empty. Her husband appeared in a triangular door. "Did you call?" he asked irritably. "No," she cried. I thought I heard you cry out." "Did I? I was almost asleep and had a dream." "In the daytime? You don't often do that." She sat as if struck in the face by the dream. "How strange! How very strange," she murmured. "The dream." "Oh?" He evidently wished to return to his book. "I dreamed about a man." "A man?" "A tall man. 6 feet 1 inch tall." "How absurd! A giant, a misshapen giant?" "Somehow," she tried the words, "he looked all right, in spite of being tall. And he had, oh, I know you'll think it's silly, he had blue eyes." "Blue eyes? Gods!" cried Mr. K. "What'll you dream next? I suppose he had black hair." "How did you guess?" She was excited. "I picked the most unlikely color," he replied coldly. "Well, black it was," she cried, "and he had a very white skin. Oh, he was most unusual. He was dressed in a strange uniform, and he came down out of the sky and spoke pleasantly to me." She smiled. "Out of the sky? What nonsense!" "He came in a metal thing that glittered in the sun," she remembered. She closed her eyes to shape it again. "I dreamed there was the sky and something sparkled like a coin thrown into the air, and suddenly it grew large and fell down softly to land. A long silver craft, round and alien, and a door opened in the side of the silver object, and this tall man stepped out." "If you worked harder, you wouldn't have these silly dreams." "I rather enjoyed it," she replied, lying back. "I never suspected myself of such an imagination. Black hair, blue eyes, and white skin. What a strange man. And yet quite handsome." "Wishful thinking." "You're unkind. I didn't think him up on purpose. He just came in my mind while I drowsed. It wasn't like a dream. It was so unexpected and different. He looked at me and he said, 'I've come from the 3rd planet in my ship. My name is Nathaniel York.'" "A stupid name. It's no name at all," objected the husband. "Of course it's stupid because it's a dream," she explained softly. "And he said, 'This is the first trip across space. There are only 2 of us in our ship, myself and my friend Bert.'" Another stupid name. "And he said, 'We're from a city on Earth. That's the name of our planet,'" continued Mrs. K. "That's what he said. Earth was the name he spoke. And he used another language. Somehow I understood him. With my mind. Telepathy, I suppose." Mr. K. turned away. She stopped him with a word. "Yil?" she called quietly. "Do you ever wonder if there are people living on the 3rd planet?" "The 3rd planet is incapable of supporting life," stated the husband patiently. "Our scientists have said there's far too much oxygen in their atmosphere." "But wouldn't it be fascinating if there were people? And they traveled through space in some sort of ship?" "Really, Yilla, you know how I hate this emotional wailing. Let's get on with our work." It was late in the day when she began singing the song as she moved among the whispering pillars of rain. She sang it over and over again. "What's that song?" snapped her husband at last, walking in to sit at the fire table. "I don't know." She looked up, surprised at herself. She put her hand to her mouth, unbelieving. The sun was setting. The house was closing itself in like a giant flower with the passing of light. A wind blew among the pillars. The fire table bubbled its fierce pool of silver lava. The wind stirred her russet hair, crooning softly in her ears. She stood silently looking out into the great sallow distances of sea bottom, as if recalling something, her yellow eyes soft and moist. "Drink to me only with thine eyes, and I will pledge with mine," she sang softly, quietly, slowly. "Or leave a kiss within the cup, and I'll not ask for wine." She hummed now, moving her hands in the wind ever so lightly, her eyes shut. She finished the song. It was very beautiful. "Never heard that song before. Did you compose it?" he inquired, his eyes sharp. "No. Yes. No. I don't know, really." She hesitated wildly. "I don't even know what the words are. They're another language." "What language?" She dropped portions of meat numbly into the simmering lava. "I don't know." She drew the meat forth a moment later, cooked, served on a plate for him. It's just a crazy thing I made up, I guess. I don't know why." He said nothing. He watched her drown meats in the hissing fire pool. The sun was gone. Slowly, slowly, the night came in to fill the room, swallowing the pillars and both of them, like a dark wine poured to the ceiling. Only the silver lava's glow lit their faces. She hummed the strange song again. Instantly, he leaped from his chair and stalked angrily from the room. Later, in isolation, he finished supper. When he arose, he stretched, glanced at her, and suggested, yawning, "Let's take the flame birds to town tonight to see an entertainment." "You don't mean it," she said. "Are you feeling well?" "What's so strange about that?" "But we haven't gone for an entertainment in 6 months." "I think it's a good idea." "Suddenly you're so solicitous," she said. "Don't talk that way," he replied. "Do you or do you not want to go?" She looked out at the pale desert. The twin white moons were rising. Cool water ran softly about her toes. She began to tremble just the least bit. She wanted very much to quietly sit there, soundless, not moving until this thing occurred, this thing expected all day, this thing that could not occur, but might. A drift of song brushed through her mind. "I do you good," he urged. "Come along now." "I'm tired," she said. "Some other night." "Here's your scarf." He handed her a file. "We haven't gone anywhere in months." Oh, by the way, that's file, Phial, which means a sort of glass receptacle. "We haven't gone anywhere in months. Except you twice a week to Z City." She wouldn't look at him. "Business," he said. "Oh," she whispered to herself. From the file, a liquid poured, turned to blue mist, settled about her neck, quivering. The flame birds waited like a bed of coals glowing on the cool, smooth sands. The white canopy ballooned on the night wind, flapping softly, tied by 1,000 green ribbons to the birds. Yilla laid herself back in the canopy, and, at a word from her husband, the birds leaped, burning toward the dark sky. The ribbons tautened, the canopy lifted. The sand slid whining under, the blue birds as they rose higher, like 10,000... Oh, sorry, I skipped a line. The sand slid whining under. The blue hills drifted by, leaving their home behind. The raining pillars, the caged flowers, the singing books, the whispering floor creaks. She did not look at her husband. She heard him crying out to the birds as they rose higher, like 10,000 hot sparkles, so many red-yellow fireworks in the heavens, tugging the canopy like a flower petal, burning through the wind. She didn't watch the dead, ancient bone-chest cities slide under, or the old canals filled with emptiness and dreams. Past dry rivers and dry lakes they flew like a shadow of the moon, like a torch burning. She watched only the sky. The husband spoke. She watched the sky. "Did you hear what I said?" "What?" He exhaled. "You might pay attention." "I was thinking." "I never thought you were a nature lover, but you're certainly interested in the sky tonight," he said. "It's very beautiful." "I was figuring," said the husband slowly. "I thought I'd call Hula tonight. I'd like to talk to him about us spending some time. Oh, only a week or so in the Blue Mountains. It's just an idea. The Blue Mountains." She held to the canopy rim with one hand, turning swiftly toward him. "Oh, it's just a suggestion." "When do you want to go?" she asked, trembling. "I thought we might leave tomorrow morning. You know, an early start and all that," he said, very casually. "But we never go this early in the year." "Just this once, I thought," he smiled. "Do us good to get away. Some peace and quiet. You know. You haven't anything else planned. We'll go, won't we?" She took a breath, waited, and then replied, "No." "What?" His cry startled the birds. The canopy jerked. "No," she said firmly. "It's settled. I won't go." He looked at her. They did not speak after that. She turned away. The birds flew on, 10,000 firebrands down the wind. In the dawn, the sun, through the crystal pillars, melted the fog that supported Yilla as she slept. All night she had hung above the floor, buoyed by the soft carpeting of mist that poured from the walls when she lay down to rest. All night she had slept on this silent river like a boat upon a soundless tide. Now the fog burned away. The mist level lowered until she was deposited upon the shore of wakening. She opened her eyes. Her husband stood over her. He looked as if he had stood there for hours watching. She did not know why, but she could not look him in the face. "You've been dreaming again," he said. "You spoke out and kept me awake. I really think you should see a doctor." "I'll be all right." "You talked a lot in your sleep." "Did I?" She started up. Dawn was cold in the room. A gray light filled her as she lay there. "What was your dream?" She had to think a moment to remember. "The ship. It came from the sky again, landed, and the tall man stepped out and talked with me, telling me little jokes, laughing, and it was pleasant." Mr. K touched a pillar. Founts of warm water leaped up, steaming. The chill vanished from the room. Mr. K's face was impassive. "And then," she said, "this man, who said his strange name was Nathaniel York, told me I was beautiful and kissed me." "Ha!" cried the husband, turning violently away, his jaw working. "It's only a dream." She was amused. "Keep your silly feminine dreams to yourself." "You're acting like a child." She lapsed back upon the few remaining remnants of chemical mist. After a moment, she laughed softly. "I thought of some more of the dream," she confessed. "Well, what is it? What is it?" "Yill, you're so bad-tempered. Tell me. You can't keep secrets from me." His face was dark and rigid as he stood over her. "I've never seen you this way," she replied, half shocked, half entertained. "All that happened was this Nathaniel York person told me. Well, he told me that he'd take me away into his ship, into the sky with him, and take me back to his planet with him. It's really quite ridiculous." "Ridiculous, is it?" he almost screamed. "You should have heard yourself, fawning on him, talking to him, singing with him. Oh, gods, all night you should have heard yourself." "Gil!" When's he landing? Where's he coming down with his damned ship? Yill, lower your voice. Voice be damned. He bent stiffly over. And in this dream, he seized her wrist, didn't the ship land over in Green Valley? Didn't it? Answer me. Why, yes, and it landed this afternoon, didn't it? He kept at her. Yes, I think so, but only in a dream. Well, he flung her hand away stiffly. It's good you're truthful. I heard every word you said in your sleep. You mentioned the valley and the time. Breathing hard, he walked between the pillars like a man blinded by a lightning bolt. Slowly his breath returned. She watched him as if he were quite insane. She arose finally and went to him. Yill, she whispered. I'm all right. You're sick? No. He forced a tired smile. Just childish. Forgive me, darling. He gave her a rough pat. Too much work lately. I'm sorry. I think I'll lie down a while. You were so excited. I'm all right now. Fine. He exhaled. Let's forget it. Say, I heard a joke about UL yesterday. I meant to tell you. What do you say? You fix breakfast. I'll tell the joke, and let's not talk about all this. It was only a dream. Of course. He kissed her cheek mechanically. Only a dream. At noon, the sun was high and hot, and the hills shimmered in the light. Aren't you going to town? Asked Yilla. Town? He raised his brows faintly. This is the day you always go. She adjusted a flower cage on its pedestal. The flowers stirred, opened their hungry yellow mouths. He closed his book. No, it's too hot, and it's late. Oh. She finished her task and moved toward the door. Well, I'll be back soon. Wait a minute. Where are you going? She was in the door swiftly. Over to Pow's. She invited me. Today? I haven't seen her in a long time. It's only a little way. Over in Green Valley, isn't it? Yes, just a walk. Not far. I thought I'm sorry, really, really sorry, he said, running to fetch her back, looking very concerned about his forgetfulness. It slipped my mind. I invited Dr. Nilla out this afternoon. Dr. Nilla? She edged toward the door. He caught her elbow and drew her steadily in. Yes, but Pow can wait, Yilla. We must entertain Nulla. Just for a few minutes. No, Yilla. No? He shook his head. No. Besides, it's a terribly long walk to Pow's. All the way over through Green Valley and then past the canal and down, isn't it? And it'll be very, very hot. And Dr. Nilla would be delighted to see you. Well? She did not answer. She wanted to break and run. She wanted to cry out, but she only sat in the chair, turning her fingers over slowly, staring at them expressionlessly, trapped. Yilla, he murmured, you will be here, won't you? Yes, she said after a long time. I'll be here. All afternoon? Her voice was dull. All afternoon. Late in the day, Dr. Nilla had not put in an appearance. Yilla's husband did not seem overly surprised. When it was quite late, he murmured something, went to a closet, and drew forth an evil weapon, a long yellowish tube ending in a bellows and a trigger. He turned, and upon his face was a mask, hammered from silver metal, expressionless, the mask that he always wore when he wished to hide his feelings, the mask which curved and hollowed so exquisitely to his thin cheeks and chin and brow. The mask glinted, and he held the evil weapon in his hands, considering it. It hummed constantly, an insect hum. From it, hordes of golden bees could be flung out, with a high shriek, golden, horrid bees that stung, poisoned, and fell lifeless like seeds on the sand. "Where are you going?" she asked. "What?" He listened to the bellows, to the evil hum. "If Dr. Nilla is late, I'll be damned if I'll wait. I'm going out to hunt a bit. I'll be back. You be sure to stay here, right here. Now, won't you?" The silver mask glimmered. "Yes, and tell Dr. Nilla I'll return. Just hunting." The triangular door closed. His footsteps faded down the hill. She watched him walking through the sunlight until he was gone. Then she resumed her tasks with the magnetic dusts and the new fruits to be plucked from the crystal walls. She worked with energy and dispatch, but on occasion a numbness took hold of her, and she caught herself singing that odd and memorable song and looking out beyond the crystal pillars at the sky. She held her breath and stood very still, waiting. It was coming nearer. At any moment it might happen. It was like those days when you heard a thunderstorm coming, and there was the waiting silence, and then the faintest pressure of the atmosphere as the climate blew over the land in shifts and shadows and vapors, and the change pressed at your ears, and you were suspended in the waiting time of the coming storm. You began to tremble. The sky was stained and colored. The clouds were thickened. The mountains took on an iron taint. The caged flowers blew with faint sighs of warning. You felt your hair stir softly. Somewhere in the house, the voice clock sang, "Time, time, time, time," ever so gently, no more than water tapping on velvet. And then the storm. The electric illumination, the engulfments of dark wash and sounding black fell down, shutting in forever. That's how it was now. A storm gathered, yet the sky was clear. Lightning was expected, yet there was no cloud. Yilla moved through the breathless summer house. Lightning would strike from the sky any instant. There would be a thunderclap, a ball of smoke, a silence, footsteps on the path, a rap on the crystalline door, and her running to answer. "Crazy, Yilla," she scoffed. "Why think these wild things with your idle mind?" And then it happened. There was a warmth, as of a great fire passing in the air, a whirling, rushing sound, a gleam in the sky of metal. Yilla cried out. Running through the pillars, she flung wide a door. She faced the hills, but by this time there was nothing. She was about to race down the hill when she stopped herself. She was supposed to stay here, go nowhere. The doctor was coming to visit, and her husband would be angry if she ran off. She waited in the door, breathing rapidly, her hand out. She strained to see over toward Green Valley, but saw nothing. Silly woman. She went inside. You and your imagination, she thought. That was nothing but a bird, a leaf, the wind, or a fish in the canal. Sit down, rest. She sat down. A shot sounded. Very clearly, sharply, the sound of the evil insect weapon. Her body jerked with it. It came from a long way off. One shot. The swift, humming, distant bees. One shot. And then a second shot, precise and cold and far away. Her body winced again, and for some reason she started up, screaming, and never wanting to stop screaming. She ran violently through the house and once more threw wide the door. The echoes were dying away, away, gone. She waited in the yard, her face pale, for 5 minutes. Finally, With slow steps, her head down, she wandered about the pillared rooms, laying her hand to things, her lips quivering, until finally she sat alone in the darkening wine room, waiting. She began to wipe an amber glass with the hem of her scarf. And then, from far off, the sound of footsteps crunching on the thin, small rocks. She rose up to stand in the center of the quiet room. The glass fell from her fingers, smashing to bits. The footsteps hesitated outside the door. Should she speak? Should she cry out, "Come in! Oh, come in!" She went forward a few paces. The footsteps walked up the ramp. A hand twisted the door latch. She smiled at the door. The door opened. She stopped, smiling. It was her husband. His silver mask glowed dully. He entered the room and looked at her for only a moment. Then he snapped the weapon bellows open, cracked out 2 dead bees, heard them spat on the floor as they fell, stepped on them, and placed the empty bellows gun in the corner of the room as Yilla bent down and tried over and over, with no success, to pick up the pieces of the shattered glass. "What were you doing?" she asked. "Nothing," he said with his back turned. With his back turned, he removed the mask. "But the gun! I heard you fire it. Twice." "Just hunting. Once in a while, I like to hunt. Did Dr. Nilla arrive?" "No." "Wait a minute." He snapped his fingers disgustedly. "Why, I remember now. He was supposed to visit us tomorrow afternoon. How stupid of me." They sat down to eat. She looked at her food and did not move her hands. "What's wrong?" he asked, not looking up from dipping his meat in the bubbling lava. "I don't know. I'm not hungry," she said. "Why not?" "I don't know. I'm just not." The wind was rising across the sky. The sun was going down. The room was small and suddenly cold. "I've been trying to remember," she said in the silent room across from her cold, erect, golden-eyed husband. "Remember what?" He sipped his wine. "That song. That fine and beautiful song." She closed her eyes and hummed it, but it was not the song. "I've forgotten it, and somehow I don't want to forget it. It's something I want always to remember." She moved her hands as if the rhythm might help her to remember all of it. Then she lay back in her chair. "I can't remember." She began to cry. "Why are you crying?" he asked. I don't know, but I can't help it. I'm sad, and I don't know why. I cry, and I don't know why, but I'm crying." Her head was in her hands. Her shoulders moved again and again. "You'll be all right tomorrow," he said. She did not look up at him. She looked only at the empty desert and the very bright stars coming out now on the black sky. And far away there was the sound of wind rising and canal water stirring cold in the long canals. She shut her eyes, trembling. "Yes," she said. "I'll be all right tomorrow." And that is the end of the first story. And I'm going to leave it there because it is now pretty much top of the hour. And I will not analyze this particular story because it's pretty straightforward. But already you can see how, as Bradbury mentioned in that little brief excerpt that I read, he's talking about essentially an environment on Mars where people, not just Martians, but as you'll see later, where humans can also breathe, long since proved not to be true. But as Bradbury himself said, it's a myth. Science is not the point here. It's the myth that counts. And I will also just mention that I don't think it's a coincidence. I didn't plan it this way, but I don't think it's a coincidence that my Scythie had tannish golden skin and golden eyes, because as I've said many times before, I think in many ways my Scythie were more influenced by Bradbury's Martians than they were necessarily by Tolkien's elves. But there's more to say about that, and I will talk about it another time. So that's it for tonight's reading. I'll be reading again at 7 o'clock later today, for those of you who can make both live broadcasts. If not, of course, as I mentioned earlier, Chris Fab is putting these all on YouTube, and I would appreciate anybody who listens to them on YouTube would also subscribe, at least as a way of showing thank you to Chris for doing all that work for nothing other than my goodwill and my profound thanks. And as always, after a few weeks off, I'm very glad to be back with you. I hope you enjoyed the first story. They get progressively stranger as the thing goes along, and as I said, the last couple stories at least are, I think, among Bradbury's very finest stories, and they have stuck with me through my entire life since I first read them. So with that, I say again, thank you for joining me. Huge pleasure to spend time with you as always. Please take good care of yourselves. Take good care of your loved ones, your friends and neighbors. Spare a smile or a kind word or a helping hand for anybody who looks like they might need one. It never hurts to ask. People can always say, no, thanks, I'm fine. But it never hurts to ask. And sometimes, as I always say, just a kind word can help somebody who's in a difficult time. With that, I say peace and good night, good morning, good afternoon, wherever in the world you may happen to be. And I will be back in just a few hours and we'll read the next story. And yeah, ciao, Bambini. See you soon.